Sustainability.
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
You're listening to CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, and this is The Worlds We Want, a podcast powered by Future Earth that explores the bright side of climate change, namely the change part. I'm Joel Ojic.
I'm Tristan Mason, and it's April 25th. This is episode 7. Happy belated Earth Day.
Today's episode is a slightly different format compared to the one we've been developing over the last few shows, as we wanted to take advantage of an interesting public conversation that was held right here at Concordia University a few weeks ago. It was a panel called What, If Anything, is Sustainability, which is part of the annual Sustainability Across Disciplines Conference hosted by the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability.
The talk was proposed by a few research fellows at the college, and it was a way of drawing attention to the different interpretations that exist around the very word sustainability, especially when people are coming to the conversation with different disciplinary backgrounds.
Most of the conversations we've had with researchers on the show have ended up addressing in one way or another the challenge of working with people who have, at times, fundamentally different guiding assumptions in their work. That said, the kinds of transdisciplinary research that we're interested in require an open-mindedness on the part of all parties involved, and this talk provided a space to more broadly consider the question of sustainability across disciplines.
Before we get into the introductory comments from the panel, we'll let Dr. James Grant, a professor of biology, talk to us about the title of the panel.
It's a provocative way of framing the question, because it's kind of a negative way of saying it in a way. What, if anything, is? It comes from things in biology. I think the first essay I ever saw, what, if anything, is a worm? And worms don't exist taxonomically, because earthworms are different from other sorts of worms. We use it as a description of a type of life stage that aren't taxonomically real. What, if anything, are worms? Well, they're nothing. What, if anything, is a fish? That's a valid evolutionary question. Fish only exist if we are also fish.
Wait, what?
Because fish don't exist beautifully in an evolutionary sense if we exclude all the tetrapods, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, because they're all descended from fish. So it comes from asking questions about, does your word mean anything? And so it came out of this evolutionary taxonomic background, because we have words for everything. Sometimes the words are really valuable, sometimes they aren't. So fish, although we all know what we mean, it can fool you. And so people, if in the fish one, if I say human, yellow perch, shark, and say, which one is the out group? Most people say human, because if these two are fish, it's the shark. The shark is the out group, because the name fish puts together these groups that are in fact have to include mammals, because of the evolutionary history of life. So it's about, and so philosophically then you could take that kind of structure and add it to anything. What, if anything, is democracy? Would be a great one, right? Is just voting democratic, or does it mean you cannot buy votes? You cannot, every one person, one vote? That would seem to be pretty important. And then I guess, how much influence do you have in the electoral process? And so what defines a democracy? I don't know. And if anything means, is to mean the term we're talking about is meaningless. So if sustainability, is it still a powerful concept, or is it beginning meaningless because it's so powerful? If sustainability is everything, then it's nothing.
We also asked him about the timing of this discussion. Why have this conversation now?
Well, I think I think the center was great at engaging the UN and Future Earth. And then that's, Peter took this thing by the horns and got it going.
The Peter here he's referring to is Dr. Peter Stewart, now the Dean and Professor in Social Science and Humanities at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, and former Director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Centre.
But we found we didn't generate enough within center interactions. If the Loyola Center is to be an interesting, dynamic center talking about sustainability with students and faculty, we should talk to each other more, and maybe we should do academic things, which doesn't have to be writing, just having panels and discussions. And so we want to get more actively engaged, talking amongst each other. We all do our own research, right? That's almost by nature not multidisciplinary. And so this is a way to push you outside your comfort zone to talk to other people. Can we actually communicate and write something together? And so I think maybe there's certainly a sense when you read the sustainability literature that there are some people who don't like the term. They want to go resilience. In terms, whether we don't like the term sustainability or not, we know the concept, what it is. It's the most important concept, I think, for all of us for the next 200 years, for sure. And so whatever we call it, it's important. I think I know what sustainability kind of means from my point of view. And so I think it's a valuable term. And so I like to be, as an academic, you like to define terms and to use them, and hopefully others will use them too, so that we are talking about similar things. I guess our thought is sustainability, the word, is used loosely in the general public. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't know what it means. They use it as green. They use it meaning natural or organic. They use it as a synonym for those. And I don't think that they are. They slightly different meanings. And so I think it has a precise meaning, or can have a precise meaning. And what is that meaning? And is it the same to me as to a social scientist or a philosopher? And I think that's what's interesting about it. I mean, human rights is part of sustainability, but human rights is a field in its own for, it's its own sphere, which overlaps with sustainability, right? And happiness is related, you'd think, to sustainability. I think the term, if you include everything, it becomes meaningless. And so that's what we were thinking the center could take on, and that, it's a classic multidisciplinary topic. Our center has experts from different fields. We're thinking of writing a little book or something, an essay, and to make it very Concordia specific, Montreal specific, our take on it.
I'll start off with a question for you, Joel. Where did you first hear about this concept of sustainability, and what was that first impression?
I imagine I'd heard it kicked around on the news before, and I'd always thought it meant, in a real general sense, what kind of world are we all going to leave behind for Keith Richards? No, I knew it dealt with waste and not using more than we had to, and making sure that, the ecosystems and the world we need is going to be around for long enough. But it wasn't really until I got here and we started taking sustainability classes together that I was introduced to more formal ideas like the Brundtland definition and the idea of being able to take enough to satisfy our needs without compromising things for the future generations. So I guess you could say over time, my opinion of what sustainability means has been evolving.
Since coming to Concordia and doing the minor in sustainability studies, and then also just getting involved in my community, you broaden that conceptual definition to include people, the lives that they live, but also kind of just how an economy works,
right?
And how it works to serve certain ends versus others. So there was kind of like this broadening, and I guess it was a deepening understanding of the concept. But I have to admit, this panel couldn't have come at a better time, because I don't want to say I was in a bit of a crisis of faith, but because there are so many interpretations, and part of the disadvantage of being in interdisciplinary studies is that you get all those interpretations, and so you can be a bit narcotizing, or it can be a bit like there's so much out there, right?
Right. Let's just go ahead into the discussion with the introductory comments, where each panelist had 5 minutes to introduce their ideas, or mostly anyway. This session was chaired by Professor Raymond Paquin, Associate Professor in the Department of Management and Principal, Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability, who started the conversation off with a few thoughts.
I'll go ahead and throw out, there were going to be plenty of provocative statements in this, but I will use my American heritage to bring up one which struck me, and that is, how do you define sustainability? And it reminds me of a court case in the 1980s, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that is, what is pornography? And these very learned legal scholars holding the highest legal positions in my country came to the very learned conclusion of, I know it when I see it.
Senator that said that.
It became it became part of the decision. And so I find it fascinating as we discuss sustainability, as I've been doing here at this university for 10 years now, and as many of us have for much of our careers, how we still can't seem to figure it out. And so I'm looking forward to these perspectives coming up in the conversations which will stem from them.
The first panelist was Dr. James Grant, who we met just a few moments ago.
I think I've got the easy job to start with ecological sustainability. Others will have the more difficult ones. So ecology is a hierarchical discipline like most sciences. I think the three levels that are of interest are population, community, and ecosystem ecology. Maybe the biosphere, but I'll stick to these three. So sustainability 1, I call it, is a population concept. And of course, we all know this. We live by harvesting wild or semi-wild populations and have done so forever. Our wealth comes from nature almost exclusively, and when we harvest populations. And I think the key thing is the logistic growth equation, which is developed in the 1800s. So if a population can be described as growing population size over time, the key thing about the logistic growth was the carrying capacity, the limit. That idea of limits is not that old, although I think the idea is probably in every culture that has ever farmed or collected or hunted. And so then the key becomes, if this is the logistic growth equation, one of the two classic growth models in ecology, it's not meant to be true, it's meant to be a description of what might happen. But then what comes out of interest is we're interested in harvesting populations, whether wild or domestic. We can call it the biological interest rate or just sustainable harvest or population growth rate on the y-axis versus population size. This is what every culture wants to know. And of course, there's the carrying capacity. And so what's sustainable harvest? Well, it is 0 at K. And this is the kind of cool thing. If you start harvesting a population that's never been harvested, there is no sustainable yield. You have to decrease the density, create some population growth, and then you can harvest. And so then sustainable yield can be anything below that red line. So sustainability 1, take the interest but not the capital, this nice, clean definition. If you take only that excess production, you can harvest the population indefinitely, the beauty behind sustainability. In the old parable, teach a man to fish, and he will eat for a lifetime, unless you teach him how to use a trawler, and that's not so good. But that's the economics of sustainability. So sustainability 2 then becomes the community level. It's a community concept. You can't just harvest individual species in isolation of others because they affect communities exist. Optimal yields have to be calculated within a community context, which of course could include humans. And so we've done a lot of stupid things we've harvested. One of them was harvesting whales. Going back to the 70s, Robert May wrote this paper. It was very cool. Not only was harvesting whales kind of a dumb idea, then we started harvesting krill at the same time, whale food. And this is a very vexed problem. So imagine if you don't harvest krill at all, the little shrimp-like creatures, there might be a sustainable yield of whales, whether or not we want to actually take that yield. But the more you then start harvesting krill, the maximum yield of whales goes down. And so you have to realize their community interactions. And so this is the joint maximum yield, sustainable yields of those two groups of organisms. But what do? We tend to ignore that interaction and then just say, oh, you can harvest whales at that level and krill at that level, and of course that's jointly unsustainable. Both groups of species will crash. Okay, and then sustainability 3 is an ecosystem concept, and you can trace the roots to many places. I think the limits to growth are incredibly important. The notion of ecosystem services, and the Costanza paper is not the first, but maybe the most influential. And then these ideas have embedded in the idea of planetary boundaries and Rockstrom et al. So as an ecosystem concept, I like ecosystem services. These are inadvertently provided, ecosystems inadvertently provide these services for humanity. Inadvertent is the key word. And the concept of pollination is probably the nicest one. So pollinators pollinate most of our food. Without them, we'll have to do it ourselves. And so we could put economic value on that service if we chose to do so. Here are maybe the top 10 services according to Costanza et al. Nutrient cycling is number 1. So then how does this help us with the concept of sustainability at the ecosystem level? Maybe we're interested in pollination services or water or whatever the service. Well, an ecosystem can only provide a certain amount. I'll say fixed, but again, we know things change, but we can think about, well, let's think about a stable world. There's only so much service that is there for us to use. So we can harvest those services if we choose to do that. But then, so if we put the value on the y-axis, then we do stuff to ecosystems, like we destroy them or destroy the biodiversity. And so one might think of, how do the value of those services, how are they a function of the x-axis? That's the key question. We don't know. We can imagine it goes up in some way, but we don't know. But the upshot of this is any destruction of habitat or biodiversity leads to fewer services for us to use for free, which affects our economy. So what's ecological sustainability then from those 3 ways? Population, take the interest, don't touch the capital when harvesting populations. Adjust your yields depending on community dynamics. 3, take advantage of free ecosystem services, but don't touch. But if you touch the capital, the quantity and quality will decline.
Our second speaker is Dr. Amy Petit, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, who you'll recognize if you listen to our last show when she talked to us about her studying, amongst other things, the management of the commons.
All right, so I have the topic of social and political sustainability. The first thing here is that whereas we have a general agreement about the definition of sustainability for sustainable development from the Brundtland Report, and we just heard a definition of sustainability or a set of definitions for sustainability for ecology, we don't really have the same sort of consensus understanding of what is sustainable when we talk about the social and political realm. So we move towards simply ordinary language meanings of what is sustainable. So if we look at that, then we're talking about simply what is required to be able to maintain something undefined for an extended period. In an extended period, we still also have to think about what do we mean by extended period. We could be talking about 10, 20 years, generations, forever. It's not really clear. The other thing is that when you go to the ordinary language meaning of the term, you can think about sustainable both in terms of something being sustainable, so sustainable development, or a form of sustainability. And I'm going to argue that when we talk about things being socially or politically sustainable, we're talking about the second form. What is it that we require in a social or political realm to have sustainability, to maintain something? Okay, so we have left undefined what is the something, right? Okay, so we have a variety of things that I have here in terms of things that we could be interested in sustaining, and they're not all environmental. When we're talking about something being socially or politically sustainable, we oftentimes are talking about other things besides environmental sustainability. We could be talking about my list here, peace or order, democracy, economic growth, yes, or development. We could also think about particular policies as being socially or politically sustainable or not being socially or politically sustainable. All right, so then we're looking at what can influence sustainability. It can be the ecological system and dynamics. It can be technological conditions, or it can be the social, economic, and political systems and conditions. So when we look at social and political conditions and dynamics, we're looking at a wide range of different things. Social is rather large. So we could be talking about things related to demography. We could be talking about economic factors. We could be talking about partisanship. We could be talking about attitudes. We could be talking about a variety of different things that fall within this category of the social. I've even got here cognitive psychological processes. So again, to say that something is socially or politically sustainable does not necessarily mean that we're talking about it being socially or politically sustainable for sustainable development or for ecological ends. So I would make the argument that to say that something is socially or politically sustainable does not necessarily mean that it supports sustainable development, but that sustainable development requires that we have social and political sustainability as well as ecological sustainability. We need all three. And so we can think about examples of this. I have this example. I have a couple of different things in mind in terms of examples. This example really struck me when I saw this. Quartz is one of these online things. So they had this story recently about African elephants and how they're communicating with each other. And through their communications, they're able to identify places that are safer. And they're actually migrating to safer locations. One of those being Botswana, which is a country in which I've done research for decades. Well, here's a quote. Botswana is now home to roughly 130,000 elephants, which represents fully a third of the continent's elephant population. Okay? Not only is this a large portion of the elephant population in a single country, but we've seen an increase here of 30,000 elephants in Botswana since 1995, as you have decreases in the total number across the continent. So on the one hand, Botswana likes to say, okay, we're a safe haven for the elephants. You know, they've got a hunting ban. They're trying to promote themselves as a bastion of sustainability in terms of maintaining the wildlife. And yet, if you look at this sort of dynamic, you have to ask yourself whether this is sustainable. Now, we might say, I was thinking maybe this is not the best example because I think there's probably issues here in terms of ecological sustainability as well as the social and political. I'm not really sure that having all the population of elephants in a single country instead of dispersed is really a good thing from an ecological perspective. But if we put even that issue aside and we were to say that, okay, maybe having all the elephants in a single country does not present issues related to population dynamics and so forth, I still have questions about whether this would be socially or politically sustainable, right? Because there are tensions between the elephants and the people. And as the numbers of elephants increase, as much as the government says that they want to have protection for the elephants and a hunting ban and so forth, those policies actually are quite controversial. They're controversial because they eliminate possibilities for hunting for people who rely on hunting for sustenance. They're also arguably unsustainable from a social and political perspective because the elephants are competing with people for territory. And the areas that are designated for wildlife protection are areas that are not available for people for agriculture or livestock or fishing or whatever else. And so there's a real resentment in the areas that have high levels of wildlife, which means that they will vote for candidates who are not necessarily wanting to have the same levels of protection. It also means that they're not necessarily following the rules that are put in place in terms of the hunting ban. So I guess at the moment the elephants still think that Botswana is better than elsewhere because they're coming in and they are choosing to migrate to Botswana. But I'm not sure that this is a sustainable arrangement.
Up next is our regular co-host, Cheryl Gladue.
Okay, so my name's Cheryl. I'm a PhD candidate here at Concordia University, and I'm doing the ill-advised thing of talking about something I don't know a whole lot about. Not about sustainability, but I'm going to talk about sustainability as a cultural practice. I'm not an anthropologist, so that's where the risk lies. We'll see how it goes. It was more of a thought experiment for me. I also brought a script because I am tangential, and I'm going to try to bring that in for our 5 minutes here. So just to say, I feel that sustainability is ultimately about human survival. We like to think about saving the planet or particular at-risk species, but we're mostly talking about saving a planet that can support humans. And at the moment, what we're trying to do is we're trying to save humans from ourselves. So, if you were to imagine building an AI or an artificial intelligence and program that artificial intelligence to remove the fewest number of species in order to save the planet, it's very likely that they would first stop would be us, right? And so it might be a really noble goal to try to save humans, but it's also very likely that we're a little bit biased. So in this way, the pursuit of sustainability is an approach to securing human survival. And if we accept this, I would like to suggest this draws a strong parallel between culture. In that culture, amongst other things, is the accumulation of generations of adaptations, enabling people to survive in their particular environment. So culture is in part what allowed a bipedal, hairless ape to live in all areas of the planet, in places that we never evolved physiologically to fit in. When biology lacks behind, no offense to biologists, it's culture that steps up to help us evolve in order to survive. So it's the accumulation of technologies, practices, methods of communication within and between groups that's helped communities continue from one generation to the next. Sure, we have some regional physiological adaptations. Some of us have different skin tone, different approaches to metabolism, height, but we also have clothing and buildings, cultivated foods, language, and ritual. and that have been, up until very, very recently, very rooted in place. That said, we know today that the genetic ancestors of some lost cultures are still with us today. They survived, but in a different cultural form. So whether it be a slow decline in response to the invasion of other cultures or a climate change-induced migration that forced new cultural adaptations, we persisted. In this way, it might be fair to suggest that our present-day unsustainable behaviors, the behaviors that threaten human survival, lacks culture. It lacks a real connection with the very things that will enable us to survive as a collective. From the global scale of our demands on and from the Earth, and to our assumptions about what constitutes a good life, Western culture, whatever that means, is struggling to understand its relationship with its wider context. And for this, a lot of us feel lost and disconnected. So all this to say, if any of us were to survive this, and some of us will, at least likely for a time, we know that those people will develop a cultural practice around living in this new world. What we don't know is whether these cultural practices will be fair for the most number of people. Architect and visionary Buckminster Fuller suggested that whether it is to be utopia or oblivion will be a touch-and-go relay race right up to the final moment. And it is a race, and I think we're approaching the final stretch of it. The interesting thing about culture is that it's something that we participate in making. It's reassuring to think that at least some of these problems can't be shrugged off as, well, that's just human nature, and accepted as inevitable. We can participate in creating the kinds of places that are rerouted in place and to one another. We can share and learn from the models that are developed all over the world and adapt them to our place. We can adapt. It's one of our strong suits. That's what humans do best. But we have to be proactive about it if we want a culture that goes beyond survival towards one that's also fair and good.
Now we're going to hear from Matthias Fritsch.
All right, so...
professor in the philosophy department.
5 minutes.
What follows has been described as a philosopher's 5 minutes. So, get comfortable.
Maybe the first idea I would say is, well, we've been struggling to define it, and then we say, well, maybe we recognize it when we see it. Not so sure that's also true in the case of sustainability compared to pornography, for example. It may be that sustainability, the way that we think about it, is in fact not definable because it's not a single concept. It's what in philosophy or in political philosophy we would call an inherently contested concept. So democracy, for example, or the human, these are concepts around which practices and struggles take place. And so to insist that there's only one definition is to sort of try to shut down that struggle, and the struggle may be very much a part of what the concept is trying to name. So it may be important, in fact, to allow sustainability to take on different definitions in different contexts. Now, in philosophy, the concept of sustainability has received quite some attention, especially in environmental philosophy and in social and political philosophy. And I would say there are basically 3 different kinds of sustainability concepts or definitions or attempts to fill that concept with content. And those different definitions, I would say there's a weak sustainability, strong sustainability, and what some people call absurdly strong sustainability. And they all have to do with some of the issues that have already come up. In particular, the struggle around what are we sustaining? Presumably it involves the environment and nature to some extent, and we're sustaining it for future people. So the relationship between future generations on the one hand and nature on the other is at the heart of these different definitions, I think. So I would say that weak sustainability, you could say, would say that we're sustaining for the sake of human welfare. And so for future human welfare, or we're sustaining capital stock, however you define capital, as a means to satisfy the needs or achieve threshold levels of welfare for future people. So where capital is usually divided between natural capital, so ecology in Jim's presentation, environmental and natural resources, for example, human-made capital, so Cheryl's culture, and cultivated capital that straddles those two. So, for example, tilled land, cultivated land would be both natural or ecological on the one hand and human-made on the other. By natural capital, then, is meant nature in as much as it is utilizable by humans. So the very definition or the very talk of capital tends to have, and that we will see come up again in the notion of absurdly strong sustainability. So the very language of capital is supposed to reflect what is utilizable by humans and what is to be sustained then for future generations. And the notion of capital, natural capital, for example, is supposed to make it measurable. So that often sort of hides conflicts between different moral judgments. So I would say that most versions of sustainable development, so we often talk of sustainability and then we talk of sustainable development. Most versions of sustainable development belong here. So for example, the definition from the Brundtland Commission that we've already heard about. I mean, that definition is a definition of sustainable development, and development always puts a particular slant on it. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet its needs. By the way, there's a lot of philosophy that went into that, and a number of people on that commission were students of Hans Jonas, a famous philosopher who wrote a book in 1979, one of the first book-length treatments of intergenerational justice. It's called The Imperative of Responsibility.
Just a little note here. As always, links to the books and articles are available in the show notes.
So that's weak sustainability. It expects and prioritizes continued economic growth, but only to the extent that this is limited by, I think, what Jim called planetary boundaries. So we don't want to degrade opportunities for future people to meet their needs. And we recognize that that may be if we degrade the environment to a certain extent. But the goal isn't to sustain the environment itself. The goal is to maintain or enhance certain levels of human welfare. That's weak sustainability. Strong sustainability is not happy with that. Strong sustainability wants to sustain the environment itself. And I'm going to break that down into strong and absurdly strong, or much stronger view in a moment. But here, whereas in weak sustainability, you're trying to sustain total capital, here you're trying to secure non-declining levels of natural capital in particular. And that is largely because there are two arguments behind this. One is to say that there are certain kinds of features of the natural world that cannot be replaced by human activity and making, but are needed for human well-being. So that's why you always have to sustain nature itself, even if your aim is sustaining or enhancing human welfare for future generations. And then there is another issue that is connected to that, and that is that advocates of strong sustainability believe that human capital, human-made capital, cannot substitute indefinitely for natural capital. So there's an issue of substitutability in the philosophical literature, as well as in the economic literature. You find a lot of talk of the doctrine of substitutability. So to what extent can you substitute for natural capital, human-made capital, or cultivated capital in the way that we defined it earlier? But then many people have recently argued that really the distinction between weak and strong sustainability is not a very good distinction, because in the end, in strong sustainability too, as long as we're still talking about natural capital, what matters is not nature as such, but what matters is nature to the extent that it contributes to human welfare. And so you're recognizing boundaries and limits and all that talk of limits that's so important that Jim already referenced. And yet what's at issue ultimately is sustaining nature for the sake of future generations. There are also some issues with the doctrine of substitutability that I'm not going to go into now. But you can also ask questions there. For example, I mean, there's also human capital that cannot be substituted by natural capital. So when you say that what you want to sustain is human welfare, then you must recognize there are also certain features of the human-made world that you want to sustain. So what you're really interested in is critical capital, something like that. So you need a new concept of capital. And that's partly what I think Cheryl talked about when she talked about culture as a practice for human survival, and that's to be sustained, right? So a human-made capital like culture is also not replaceable by nature, and so also would have to be sustained. And so then the distinction between weak and strong tends to break down. That's my point here, and that's why some people over the last 10, 15 years in the philosophical literature have suggested to bring in another view yet, and that other view is to say that what we should sustain isn't natural capital, but nature itself. So natural capital is always, what can we utilize from nature for the sake of human welfare, human opportunities, and so on. But the sort of absurdly strong view holds that, no, it's not natural capital, it's nature itself, it's the environment itself that ought to be sustained. And there again, you see the question, well, for what? For itself? Does it have value in itself? Or for future generations? And then again, isn't it an instrumental view of nature? So that's how the debate continues. Why is it called absurdly strong? Well, what does it mean to sustain nature itself, right? First of all, it's a very dynamic process, and things are interconnected. Species always die out, new ones come into being, and so on. So what does it mean to sustain nature itself? That would be the first problem. And the second problem, of course, is, well, what about social, political concerns with respect to human beings? Wouldn't it be okay to, let one species die out in order to feed the hungry, build shelter for the homeless, things like that? So isn't it absurdly strong? So that's the discussion in the literature there. So if you say that what we want to sustain is nature itself, then you get into these problems of, isn't it absurdly strong? So this view is also called the physical stock view, or the list of stuff view. So what we owe forward to nature or to future generations or to both on this view is everything there is, as it were. Right? So that's why people say, well, we have to itemize it. We have to list it. It's a list of stuff view or the physical stock view. Now, several attempts in the literature to address this. I'm only going to mention one here, and I'm only going to mention that because it sort of highlights the issues that need to be discussed here, and that I think in my three previous brief presentations have already been brought on the table. So you see, what we need to think about is this conflictual hanging together of nature, both in itself, Jim talked about community interactions. You can't just look at one species, you have to look at how they interact. But also with humans, so how humans are connected to nature, but not quite. If they are to sustain it, then they can't be just a part of it, right? Which is what this language of stewardship or trusteeship that we often hear in the context of discussions around sustainability is meant to capture, and that's also very important in Hans Jonas and in the Brundtland Commission from 1987. This language of stewardship, humans are the steward. Sort of my favorite approach in order to save the absurdly strong view is to speak of what I call taking turns with the earth. And I mention that because it's going to, I think, bring up some of these issues that we have discussed. So when nature is thought of as either capital or it's thought of as physical stock, the list of stuff, then we think of nature, I think, as really a list of different parts or services. So it's different elements that you're not treating them as holistically hanging together, right? And that's then reflected in the question of sustainability when you ask what should be sustained for the future, right? And then you say, well, these things, but not those things, maybe. Maybe those things are dispensable, but those are not, right? But you think of them as not really hanging together. You think of sharing with future people and future Earth. You think of that on the model of cutting up a cake. Even if you allow that, well, a certain part of the cake will grow back. If you cut out a piece, a certain part of it will grow back over time, and so you have to bring in, time frames and so on. But when we think about the way that we share things amongst each other, then we can share things by parts. We can cut them up like a cake, but we can also share things by taking turns with them, right? And it's a different way of sharing that I think better respects sort of the holistic integrity or connectedness of things with each other. So, for example, when we share a house, then certain parts of that house cannot be removed in order to share them, because then the house is no longer functioning as a house. Or sharing a bicycle, for example, right? You can maybe change the color, but you can't take one of the wheels off the bike and then give it to me when we're sharing it by turns, right? And so sharing by turns, I think, better respects the holistic integrity of an object of intergenerational sharing. Problem then is that, I mean, this captures well, I think, this idea of stewardship, so that humans are responsible for sustaining the environment, but it suggests that we're entirely indifferent to the object of sharing. Like when we share a bicycle, well, we could walk or we could take a bus, so we don't really need the bicycle. And that's not the case here, so you have to capture that somehow. So you not only have to capture the hanging together of nature as different parts, but you also have to capture that humans hang together with the earth, with nature, with the environment. And you can do that by saying, well, the earth, nature also takes turns with us, in that we're not just born of previous generations, we're also born of the earth. And when we die, we return to it. That in that way, nature or earth takes turns with us. This, what I call the physical stuff, the absurdly strong sustainability.
The final professor is Dr. Pedro Perez Neto.
Okay, so
a professor of biology, providing a biological bookend to the introductory comments.
For many years, I've been working on what we call the Canadian Network for Aquatic Ecosystem Services. This has been around for 6 years. And one of the things we learned is that we all learned that we didn't know what ecosystem services were, although we published on ecosystem services. The second thing we learned, and so it took a few years for us to find a definition of what would be some sort of a tangible or less tangible notion of ecosystem services, and then we got even worse trying to think about what would be sustainable ecosystem services. So the point, you know, I think one of the points is very interesting is that often we have a hard time defining, and maybe we don't need to define as much sustainability, but we definitely know what sustainable is not. So sometimes I wonder if it would be more useful to define sustainability by defining actually what is not sustainable. And then we sort of work down to a more sort of shaped form. So what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the notion, not a definition of sustainability sufficient for sustainability. So I want to start with a little bit of humor.
When I say sustainable,
you mean
months in the future.
You've heard environmental type people say that. So you using the word, but
I don't really know.
You don't really know what it means or how to do it.
No, I just know that it's a word that comforts people.
Yes. So you sprinkle it in.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Smart.
Just say sustainable and watch people go, oh, good, we're going to be okay, guys. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, you're a devastating human being.
So, with this notion, because one of the things that's very important is to actually percolate the notion of sustainability to the public. It's very interesting to be here and discussing what sustainable is for us, but the public has to also have some sort of hope to understand what we mean when we're trying to think as scientists and philosophers and so forth, what sustainable truly is. So there's this vague notion. And there's a lot of surveys out there that people done to have actually survey people on the streets or in the universities or, you know, try to have this notion of, in general, it's friendly, environmentally renewable, recyclable, natural, organic, green. And so there's all this environmental, almost ethic thinking towards the definition. But it's not truly a definition. It's more, what I'm trying to say is more of a notion. So I want to cover a little bit of this, so that what would make sustainability meaningful at least in my world as an ecologist. So one thing, ecological sustainability is well defined. Jim gave us sort of this definition. The rate of harvest should not exceed the rate of regeneration. Is this translatable to other systems? Probably not. Probably not in the same way that we think about social and political and economical sustainability. That might not be so easy to use as a definition. And I kind of don't quite agree with Jim in some ways that actually we know what sustainability in ecology is. And so as such, environmental protection should not equate with sustainability. It is important for sustainability, but it's not sustainability. And we can even prove that mathematically using population models such as Jim. So we actually have, if humans did not exist, conservation would not be important. And many populations on the planet and many systems would not be sustainable under a definition of sustainability. Okay, so that's one of the things that we have to think, is this little bit of divorce. Conservation is very important, very, very, very important for sustainability. But sustainability does not exist even in 100% natural systems. It's not also often, many species actually go extinct. Can we translate the ecological notion to other systems? If we can't, is it useful to have a definition for each system? I often wonder if we should have actually a very specific definition for every single system. Ecologists have a strong notion on how to make a resource, fisheries, for instance, sustainable. But we don't know what an entire sustainable ecosystem is supposed to be, particularly including humans. I don't think actually, even we've been doing this for decades, mathematically, experimentally, observationally, I don't think we know exactly what would be a good definition for a sustainable ecosystem. Ecological complexity and dynamics make it difficult to generate a strong foundation for the concept of ecological sustainability, and likely for other types of systems as well. And and likely the case for other systems, social, economics, and so forth. So is it a notion of sustainability enough? I think, I try to think notion, idea, belief, conviction, opinion, view, thought, impression, perception, funny feeling. Those are the definitions of notion. And definition is a statement of exact meaning of a word, especially in the dictionary. So how do we translate a notion? So I think we have a notion. We have a notion of sustainability. Do we need a definition for sustainability? It's not clear to me. So how do we translate a notion into sustainability targets? It seems that targets would need clear definitions. Often when we talk, we need the system to be sustainable. We need a target of sustainability. But if we have a target, but we don't have a clear definition, how do we know we reach that target or not? So it's a notion, not a definition of sustainability sufficient for sustainability. And it's not clear to me if that's the case or not. And so we need to agree on something, on certain definitions, to actually know whether we're being sustainable or not. So pornography, yeah, maybe it's true that we know when we see it, but I don't think we know when something's sustainable, even when we see it, because actually we're lacking a little bit of that hardcore biological definition that I would like to see, but I don't think it's possible.
Now, on this episode, we only have time to share with you the opening comments to a longer discussion, which opened up to an informed and engaged audience. We'll have to clean up some of that audio, but we're trying to release the whole discussion at a later date as a bonus episode. You'll receive this if you subscribe to the show on one of the various platforms that now host us.
We asked Dr. Grant a few weeks ago after the event how he felt participating in the panel went.
I guess I enjoyed it. Let's see. There's never enough time to hear from the audience, right? And so I got this. Yeah, it was very engaged audience. You always want another half an hour to let people speak. So the audience didn't get to speak that much. And of course, once they have something to say, every panel member has something to respond. I think it succeeded from our point of view. It engaged an audience there, we're all locals, we're all Concordians, pretty much, got people talking. So I think that was the idea. And also, we wanted the center to get more involved, because we haven't done enough talking to each other. So really, I didn't know Amy at all, really, before this, or Cheryl. Well, we've been to meetings together, but you got an hour, everybody says 5 minutes, but you don't actually get to engage on anything, so.
And in terms of how this conversation worked out for the Research Center?
It succeeded for us in the sense it got us talking. We're going to have a meeting in about a week where we're going to sit down and say, do we have something we want to say? Is there something we could write? It's always frustrating you never have quite enough time. And so I'm sitting next to Amy and saying, could you say that again after? Can I use that quote in the lecture? It's kind of nice to hear Amy Potita, professor at Concordia. Here's how she thinks about social sustainability. And, as students, for example, in my class, does that resonate with you, or is it just seem like, is the Brundtland definition mean something, or is it, it's vague enough that it captures the essence. To me, I see Brundtland as being almost all ecology in a way. I don't know what it says about the social side. The way it's framed about the future is almost the ecology side there. So it resonates with me, but I'm not sure it does with. So I think, thinking about my course, I think I might teach the first lecture or two differently, and have students engaging a little more on what they think it is, and looking for other views and definitions of sustainability, because it's not the easiest thing.
A question for you, Joel. What would you say is your understanding of sustainability in light of everything that has ever happened in the world? No, I'm kidding. In your experience.
I have to say, contrary to most people out there, I take a pretty positive view of it. I'd like to think that most people are a lot more aware of these things than they were before. We've had a lot of wins. We've had a lot of, honestly, changes in direction, whether that's phosphorylation of the Great Lakes or the ozone layer. There's quite a few success stories we need to look at and say, okay, the average person knows more than they ever did before. Makes more informed decisions than they ever did before, and you can't get away with a lot of things that people used to anymore, like commercial whaling and a lot of past transgresses, I guess, wouldn't be doable today. We have a long way to go, and I'm not saying everything is hunky-dory and it's going to be fantastic. What I'm saying is we are moving the ball forward. Maybe too slowly, sure, but we are getting things done.
Nice. I was actually telling Professor James Grant this last week.
Right.
And he was asking me, well, Tristan, what do you think sustainability means? And I was like, I could give him the, the Brundtland Commission said this, right, and so on. And not to get too cliche, but I do think that just the title of our podcast captures a great deal of what is intended by the concept, which is, I see it as communities which can, have different kind of levels of organizations, working for the kind of world that they specifically want, and that has to happen within environmental limits. Otherwise, they won't. In the long run, they won't prosper. They'll face some limits, and that won't be good for them, right?
Right.
But at the same time, it also means, well, they have certain ideals in society that they want to live up to, right? And you can see that in certain bodies of law, etc., legislation. You can see it also just in the norms that change over time, the attitudes that change over time. So, I guess I really think that our title kind of sums it up, at least in a sentence. And, again, we've emphasized this before, but, there's a plurality to the different kind of ways of living in the world, and we should embrace that.
So, I know what you're thinking. We asked the question, but we didn't really answer it, did we? Frustrating, right? Well, that's partly what makes this an interesting area of research and action. There are very few hard and fast answers.
So let us know what you think. You can reach out to us on the various social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Medium.
If you hadn't heard, you can now subscribe to The Worlds We Want and never miss an episode. We are now available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, and on all the other platforms where you can find your free podcasts. Tell your friends. If you can, please leave us a review so that others might find the show. This is a volunteer-run effort at the moment, so we do appreciate the support we've received thus far.
Writing by Cheryl Gladu. Thanks to Mark Muzamdar and Tracy Rodriguez, as well as Allison O'Reilly for recording help. Editing by Cheryl Gladu. Music featured in this episode is Are You Well and Lay It On Me by Best Fern, and Plans Fall Through by Alexia Avina. And of course, the whole thing is powered by Future Earth.